My name is Mia Bennett and I'm 35 years old. It was Christmas Eve when my younger sister leaned across the holiday ham, smiled sweetly, and said loud enough for everyone at the table to hear, 35 and still single? Oh, Christmas must get pretty lonely. Laughter exploded around the room. My father laughed the hardest. My mother, still holding her wine glass halfway through the toast she had been about to make, gave her familiar gentle smile and whispered, "Oh, she's only joking." I quietly set my drink on the table without saying a word. But what none of them knew was that I hadn't flown back to Ohio just to be the family's favorite punchline. I'd come home because 1 week earlier a contract had landed on my desk with my own name signed at the bottom, a signature that wasn't mine. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where we sit beside the quiet women who finally stop apologizing, the women who kept the peace until keeping it cost them everything. Grab your coffee, get comfortable, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe because this story only gets more unbelievable from here. Before I tell you what happened, you need to know who I really am, because the woman my family describes has almost nothing in common with the woman I became. I'm an acoustician. I design spaces that hold sound the way a perfect coffee cup holds warmth, without spilling, without echoing, without losing what matters. I've designed recording studios, lecture halls, and even a children's hospital in Chicago where the machines sound gentler now because I taught the walls how to absorb fear instead of throwing it back at frightened families. I built my company from a rented desk, a borrowed calibration microphone, and years of believing in myself when no one else did. Today, clients fly me across the country to make silence sound right. Yet none of that exists in my family's version of my life. To them, I'm simply the daughter who left, the one who never married on schedule, the disappointment who somehow became the joke told between mashed potatoes and pumpkin pie. I hadn't been back to Columbus in over 2 years, and honestly, I never planned to return for Christmas. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, my phone rang. It was Dale, an old technician who still worked on the Bennett Acoustics factory floor. The same man who remembered I was the one who taught him how to solder years ago. His voice was low, careful. "Keep this quiet, Mia," he said. "Your dad's about to close a huge investment deal. They're selling the panel line. Big money. He keeps telling the investors every design has been properly signed over. All in the family." He hesitated before asking the question that changed everything. "But I never saw you sign anything. Did you?" I hadn't. I booked my flight before we even hung up. I wasn't coming home for the ham, the presents, or the family toast. I came home because there was one sentence inside one contract that I needed to see with my own eyes before anyone could convince me I was imagining things. A signature seems like such a small thing, until it's yours. And it stays yours until someone decides that, like everything else in the family, it belongs to them too. Sitting at that Christmas dinner, all of that stayed hidden behind my silence while Chloe continued entertaining the table. My younger sister now ran marketing for Bennett Acoustics, which mostly meant she had become exceptionally skilled at deciding which version of the family story everyone else was allowed to hear. She stabbed another carrot with her fork and smirked. "I'm just saying, some of us actually built something." Mia went off to. "What is it again?" "Making rooms quiet." More laughter circled the table. My father slowly set down his fork and did the thing that used to make me feel so loved when I was a little girl. He spread his hands as if blessing everyone gathered there and declared proudly, "This family built something real. 50 years of the Bennett name on that building. Whatever any of us accomplishes, we do it for the name. The name comes first. It always has." Around the table, heads nodded like scripture had just been read aloud. My mother calmly topped off everyone's wine glass and murmured her favorite sentence. "Let's not make dinner about all that." It was the same sentence she always used whenever the truth tried to stand up in the middle of the room. I felt that familiar pull to shrink myself again, to smile politely, laugh at my own expense, smooth everything over, and let the evening continue peacefully. I'd been doing exactly that for 15 years. I had become the quiet room where nobody ever had to hear the uncomfortable truth. But something was different that night. I looked down at my glass. I looked across the table at my mother, frozen halfway through another practiced smile. Then, for the very first time in a long, long while, I refused to become smaller. I gently placed my drink on the tablecloth, the way you finally set down a burden you've carried for far too long, lifted my eyes and said quietly, "Don't worry about me." My voice came out calm, almost gentle. "I've been married for a long time." The room didn't simply go quiet. Felt vacuum-sealed. You have to understand, I know silence professionally. I can tell the difference between a room that's merely empty and one that's holding its breath. This was the second kind. My mother's wineglass froze halfway through her toast, the crystal catching the light while her smile lingered just a fraction too long, the way a photograph keeps smiling after the person has already walked away. Chloe's fork tapped against her plate. "You're, what?" she asked. "Married," I repeated, folding my hands neatly in front of me. 6 years, actually. My father's eyebrows climbed toward a hairline that had been retreating for the better part of a decade. 6 years, he repeated slowly, as though the number refused to fit into any equation he knew. "You've been married for 6 years. And you never told your own family?" There it was. The pivot came before the dinner plates had even been cleared. Not "Are you happy?" Not "Who is he?" Not "Why didn't you invite us?" Just one question. How could you keep something from us? As though the secret itself was the betrayal. My mother finally lowered her glass without taking a sip. Her hand trembled almost imperceptibly. "Mia," she whispered, her voice suddenly thin. "Why would you hide something like that?" I looked around the table at the people who had spent years turning my life into the evening's entertainment, and I wondered how to explain that you don't hand your happiness to people who've repeatedly shown you exactly what they'll do with the things you love. But I wasn't ready to say that aloud. Not yet. Instead, I answered simply, because I wanted one thing that belonged only to me. The questions came all at once, colliding over each other. Not because they were curious, but because they were caught off guard. What's his name? What does he do? Why isn't he here? Is he ashamed of us? That last one came from Chloe. She meant it to sting. Once upon a time it would have. Instead, I gave them almost nothing. "His name is Adrian. He's away on business." "No, he isn't ashamed of you. Yes, the marriage is real. There are rings, a lease, and a life together." My answer stayed short. Not out of cruelty, but out of instinct. The same instinct that makes you shield a tiny flame with your hand when the wind starts blowing. My father leaned back in his chair and studied me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher then. An expression that would make perfect, terrible sense later. "Well," he finally said, "full of surprises." My mother reached across the table and gently rested her hand on my wrist. For one dangerously hopeful second, I almost let myself believe her warmth was real. "We just want to be part of your life, sweetheart," she said softly. I wanted to believe those words so badly it frightened me. But I hadn't flown from Chicago, rented a car at the Columbus airport, and driven back to this house because I suddenly wanted my family back. Come for a document. Sitting there with my mother's hand on my wrist and my sister's laughter still hanging in the room like smoke, I realized something cold and unmistakable. They thought my marriage was the biggest surprise waiting at that table. It wasn't. The real surprise was locked inside a manila folder sitting in a filing cabinet just a few yards away. A folder containing a contract with my name forged across the bottom. And I was the only person in that room who knew it existed. To understand why that folder mattered, though, you have to go back 11 years. Back to the panel that changed everything. When I was 24, Bennett Acoustics was only 3 months away from shutting its doors forever. I'd already left home at 20. I had escaped the noise, the criticism, the constant shrinking of who I was. Even so, I still came back on weekends because I honestly believed families could be repaired if one person worked hard enough. Back then, the company manufactured ordinary gray acoustic ceiling panels, the kind you've seen in thousands of office buildings. Sales were collapsing because nobody wanted them anymore. So I spent an entire winter alone in the workshop designing something different. A layered acoustic core engineered to preserve warmth and clarity without muddying the sound. Didn't just absorb noise, it shaped it. I built the very first prototype with my own hands. Before sealing the frame, I quietly signed the inside where no one would ever think to look, the way a master violin maker signs the hidden interior of an instrument. Just my initials. And one sentence I truly believed in. That single panel would go on to save the company. The orders came pouring back. The Bennett name stayed on that building for another decade because of a design a 24-year-old woman created alone in an unheated workshop during the middle of winter. Then, slowly, as these things always happen, the story was rewritten without me in it. My invention stopped being Mia's panel and became the Bennett panel. Soon after that, it became Dad's breakthrough. I let it happen. I told myself credit didn't matter anymore, that I had my own work, my own city, my own quiet life. I convinced myself that allowing my family to keep the recognition was an act of love. That was the lie I'd been living inside. A lie as perfectly sealed as one of the soundproof rooms I designed. Now that very same panel, my panel, had become the crown jewel of a business deal worth more money than my father had ever imagined. And somewhere inside a manila folder was a document claiming I had willingly signed away everything I created. The next morning I drove to Bennett Acoustics, telling everyone I simply wanted to see the old place decorated for Christmas. That part, at least, wasn't entirely false. The building looked more successful than it ever had when I was growing up. Fresh paint covered the walls. A sleek glass conference room overlooked the factory floor. A polished brass plaque beside the entrance proudly displayed the founding year beneath my father's name, engraved like a family crest. Visitors filled the lobby. Men in tailored winter coats, a woman carrying a leather portfolio, all wearing the cautious confidence of people deciding whether to invest millions of dollars. My father was exactly where he loved to be, leading them proudly through the showroom. "Everything you see here," he declared, "we own outright. Every patent, every design, every innovation has been legally assigned to the company. Clean as a whistle. Signed and sealed years ago. We keep everything in the family." The investors nodded approvingly while the woman made careful notes in her portfolio. Standing beside a rack of Christmas cards, I felt the floor shift beneath me because I knew with absolute certainty that at least one of those signatures had never been given willingly. If you've ever walked back into a place that made you feel smaller the instant you crossed the threshold, then you already know the sound. A room filled with confident people discussing something you created as though you had never existed. Stay with me, because stories like this always become quieter just before they become impossible to ignore. If this resonates with you, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and subscribe, because what happened next changed everything. I watched my father shake hands with one of the investors. I heard him repeat the word clean again, and as a snowflake melted onto the sleeve of my coat, I made a decision. I wasn't letting anyone sell my work or my name until I had read every page of that contract myself. I approached him casually and asked if I could look over the intellectual property paperwork. I framed it as nothing more than professional curiosity, one designer admiring how another company structured a clean assignment agreement. Before my sentence was even finished, Chloe stepped directly into my path. She had always possessed remarkable instincts for choosing exactly the wrong moment. Folding her arms with a smile that looked friendly until you met her eyes, she asked, "Why would you need to see those documents?" Then she added, "You don't actually work here anymore, Mia. You haven't for years. Honestly. It's not really your business." I told her I was simply interested. She tilted her head, smiling wider. "See, this is your problem," she said loudly enough for nearby employees to hear. "You disappear for 15 years, show up with a secret husband, and suddenly you want to dig into the biggest business deal this family has ever had. People might start thinking you're jealous." She laughed lightly, performing for everyone within earshot. At that exact moment, my mother walked by carrying a tray of Christmas cookies for the guests. Without even slowing her pace, she smiled and said, "Oh, she's only joking, Mia. Don't make a face." There it was again, that familiar sentence I'd heard my entire life. "She's only joking." A harmless little phrase that somehow transformed every insult into humor, and every wound into my own overreaction. It was a spell. To erase things. For 35 years it had erased my hurt, and now it was about to be used to erase something far more serious. A felony. I smiled anyway. I let the moment pass because I suddenly realized asking permission had been my first mistake. You don't ask people who forged your signature whether you're allowed to examine the forgery. So I stopped asking and started looking on my own. A few minutes later, Dale found me standing near the loading dock, his hands shoved deep into his coveralls while his breath drifted into the cold December air. "You didn't hear this from me," he muttered before quietly leading me into a small side office. Sitting on the conference table was a thick due diligence binder, neatly tabbed and photocopied for the investors to review. "Nobody's in here," he whispered, taking his place in the doorway to watch the hallway while I hurriedly flipped through the pages. My fingers stopped at the divider labeled Intellectual Property Assignments. There it was, a single-page legal agreement transferring every right, every patent, and every piece of ownership. The document transferred all rights, title, and interest in the chambered baffle design from the inventor to Bennett Acoustics Incorporated. It was dated 5 years earlier and signed on the line that read, "Inventor, Mia Bennett." My entire body went still in the peculiar way it always does when the professional part of my mind takes over because the rest of me can't afford to. I stared at the signature. I've signed my name hundreds of thousands of times. I know its rhythm the way you know your own heartbeat. This wasn't mine. It was close enough to fool someone who had never seen me write, but not close enough to fool me. The M was too round. The tail of the final T crossed in the wrong direction. Worst of all, the signature sat perfectly straight across the line instead of drifting ever so slightly downhill the way mine has since 4th grade. Someone had practiced. Someone had studied examples of my handwriting until they could imitate it well enough to deceive a stranger. Just not the person who had lived with that signature her entire life. Standing alone in that borrowed office while cold December light filtered through the blinds, I felt something I had spent 15 years refusing to feel about my own family. It wasn't grief. It wasn't even anger, not yet. It was certainty. Cold, clean, unshakable. Someone I loved had sat down with a pen and deliberately learned how to become me. Whenever the ground shifts beneath my feet, I do what I've always done. I gather evidence. I photographed every page carefully, front and back, making sure the lighting was clear enough to preserve every detail. Then I checked the date because a signature isn't just ink on paper. It's a claim about where a person was on a particular day, and sometimes that claim can be disproved. The assignment agreement was dated in April 5 years earlier. That April I wasn't anywhere near Ohio. I was in Rotterdam, presenting a paper at an international acoustics conference. My name appeared in the printed program. I stood in the official group photograph. My passport carried the entry stamp. My hotel invoice was billed to my own account. I remembered that week vividly because it rained every single day, and I gave the best presentation of my career to a room full of people who finally understood exactly what I did. On the very day this document claimed I was sitting in Columbus signing away the most valuable thing I'd ever created, I was nearly 4,000 miles away in the Netherlands, finally being taken seriously. This wasn't a clerical mistake. Nobody accidentally copies someone else's signature onto a legal document. Nobody accidentally forges a date. Someone made a conscious decision to replace my consent with my name because asking me would have risked hearing the one answer they didn't want. I closed the binder exactly as I had found it, careful not to disturb a single page. I thanked Dale only with my eyes because his livelihood still depended on the people inside that building. Then I walked calmly back into the lobby where my father was laughing with the investors. I smiled politely, looked him straight in the face, and thought, I know now. Finally know. And you have no idea that I know. I kept that knowledge to myself for one more day, carrying it like a piece of hot coal tucked safely inside a cold pocket. That evening I helped my mother in the kitchen because I needed to understand how far the lie reached. My mother has never been able to keep what she believes is good news to herself. I dried dishes while she washed them, keeping my voice comfortably warm, the temperature of harmless conversation. "It's funny," I said casually. "I don't even remember signing anything over to the company all those years ago." Her hands slowed beneath the warm soapy water. "Oh, sweetheart," she replied gently, as though comforting a child after a bad dream. You didn't need to worry about any of that. Your father handled all the paperwork for you. You were always so busy with your rooms." She smiled fondly. He said, "Why make me a fuss over forms when everything stays in the family anyway? He took care of it. He handles everything." She looked genuinely proud of him, proud of the arrangement, proud of the man she believed was protecting his daughter. She had absolutely no idea she had just confirmed the truth. My father had signed my name. My mother knew it in the quiet, unquestioning way she'd always known things, and to her it wasn't fraud. It wasn't theft. It wasn't a crime. It was simply a husband making life easier for his child. "The family name comes first," she added as she dried her hands, repeating my father's favorite line without realizing she was quoting it. "You know how your father is." I did know how he was. What I was only beginning to understand was how often I had mistaken that sentence for permission instead of accountability. I placed the last clean plate into the drying rack, kept my expression perfectly calm, and asked as casually as I could whether Dad was still keeping the old company records. There was no point avoiding the conversation anymore. If my father had truly done this, and genuinely believed it was an act of love, then I needed to hear him justify it to my face, without investors watching and without an audience to perform for. I found him in his study, sitting in his usual leather chair with a glass of bourbon in one hand and the handwritten company ledger open in front of him. I quietly closed the door behind me. I didn't raise my voice. I've learned that the calmest person in the room is usually the one everyone ends up hearing. "Dad," I said evenly, "there's an assignment agreement in the buyer's due diligence binder with my signature on it. I never signed it." "Yes, you did," he replied without the slightest hesitation. He didn't look surprised. He didn't pretend to misunderstand. Instead, he looked at me with something that almost resembled pride and said, "So, you found it." As though I had solved a puzzle he had expected me to discover eventually. "You created that panel under this roof, Mia. You were a Bennett using Bennett tools in a Bennett building. That design was always ours. All I did was finish the paperwork you were too busy to complete. That's not stealing. That's a father cleaning up after his daughter, just like I've always done." I held his gaze. "Forging someone's signature is a crime," I said quietly. He dismissed the words with a casual wave of his bourbon glass. "Family isn't a crime. You know what is? Walking away and leaving the company that raised you to die." Then, for just a moment, something beneath his certainty cracked open. He stared down at the old ledger resting on his desk. "My father did the same thing to me," he admitted. "The first production line I ever designed carried the company's name. Mine wasn't anywhere on it. I cried about it for a year. Then I finally understood. That's how families survive. You feed the family name, and one day the family name feeds you." He looked back at me, completely convinced of his own righteousness. "I did you a kindness. Someday you'll understand. That was the hardest part." He wasn't an evil man delighting in deception. He was a man who had been robbed when he was young and had spent the rest of his life convincing himself that repeating the theft was tradition instead of betrayal. I told him I wanted my name removed from the deal. I explained that the assignment agreement was legally void because I had never signed it. "That's simply the law," I said. "I'm not threatening you. I'm stating a fact." Every trace of warmth vanished from the room. My father has never been colder than the moment someone refuses to play the role he has written for them. "Removed from the deal," he repeated slowly. "Mia, do you have any idea what's closing next week? Do you understand how many jobs depend on that panel line? Dale's job. Everyone on the production floor. Your mother's retirement. This entire company." He stood, setting his glass down with deliberate care. "If you destroy this deal over one signature, over your pride, that won't be me destroying this family. It'll be you. And everyone will know it." There it was. The oldest weapon in our house, polished from years of use and placed gently back into my hands whether I wanted it or not. Responsibility. Make yourself smaller so everyone else can stay comfortable. Carry the burden no one else wants to carry. Be the good daughter. Be the strong one. Be the sacrifice. I felt that familiar pull inside my chest because for as long as I could remember, I had been the one who quietly absorbed the cost so no one else had to. That wasn't my weakness. My weakness wasn't trusting too easily. I trust almost no one. My weakness was believing that love meant disappearing so everyone else could remain comfortable. Standing there in my father's study, listening to him hand me responsibility for a crime he had committed, I finally saw the machine for what it was. It ran on me. Had always run on me. And it was still running on me in that moment, counting on the fact that I would rather burn silently than allow anyone else to feel the heat. I didn't argue. I didn't answer. I simply turned, walked out of the study, crossed the dark, silent house, and drove back to the factory one last time that night. Dale had left me a key, and when the night security guard asked why I was there, I smiled and said I'd forgotten a scarf. That wasn't why I'd come. I had returned because, in the center of the lobby, illuminated beneath a single spotlight like a museum exhibit, hung panel 001, the very first prototype, the original piece that had changed everything. The original panel 001, the one I had built by hand in a freezing workshop when I was 24, still hung in the company lobby beneath a spotlight like a priceless work of art. Beside it was a polished brass plaque that proudly read, "The Bennett Panel, the design that built our future," followed by the company logo and my father's name as founder. My own name appeared nowhere. I stood there for a long time before carefully lifting the heavy frame from its mounting bracket. It weighed more than it looked. Slowly, I turned it over and examined the back, the side no investor ever sees, the side no plaque ever reaches. There, carved into the pale wood of the inner frame, were the small block letters I'd written 11 years earlier as a hopeful 24-year-old who never imagined anyone else would see them. MB. Beneath my initials was the sentence I'd believed in enough to carve into the wood itself. The room where you can finally hear yourself think. I ran my thumb gently across those letters. They were mine. They had always been mine. The front of the panel belonged to the company, to the family name, to the investors, to the polished story told in conference rooms. But the back, the hidden side that actually carried the weight, the part that made the design work, the unseen structure holding everything together, that was me. Hidden. Load-bearing. Uncredited. Exactly like the daughter who had created it. Standing alone in that silent lobby, I spoke quietly into the empty room. Forgiveness isn't a signature. Later that night I sat alone in my rental car, staring at my phone with my husband's name glowing on the screen. I want to be completely honest about what I almost did. Adrian is an investor. That's the simplest way to describe him. He's a partner in a private investment fund. He moves money and he knows the people who move even more money. In the world where this acquisition was about to close, Adrian was not a small man. One phone call, that's all it would have taken. He could have quietly reached out to the right people, asked the right questions, and the entire deal could have vanished before anyone ever signed a final document. Or, if he chose, he could have funded the company himself and purchased my family's gratitude for the rest of their lives. I could have made all of this disappear. Or I could have walked back into that house as the hero who had saved everyone. Either way, I'd finally have been holding the one card that would force my family to see me. I sat there with my thumb hovering over his name for a long time because I want you to remember that I could have made that call. What I chose instead is the entire point of this story. If you've ever held real power over someone who hurt you, then you know exactly what it feels like to sit alone in a cold car deciding whether victory is worth becoming the person you despise. If this story speaks to you, subscribe and stay with me because this was the moment I finally got something right. I never made the call. Instead, I placed my phone in the cup holder. Using Adrian to destroy the deal, or to rescue it, would have made me exactly like my father. Someone who buries truth beneath power because power is easier than honesty. I hadn't flown home to become him. I had flown home to end the tradition. The next morning, before making any final decision, I called someone who owed me absolutely nothing and had every reason to tell me the truth. An intellectual property attorney in Chicago who had handled one of my licensing agreements years earlier. I explained everything. I told her about the design I'd created, the assignment agreement I had never signed, my father's forged signature, and the sale that was about to close based on that single fraudulent document. She listened without interrupting, then answered with the calm precision that only experienced lawyers possess. "Mia," she said, "if you never sign that agreement, it's not merely weak, it's legally void. A forged signature transfers nothing. Which means you still own your design." I asked what that meant for the sale. "It means the company doesn't have clear title to the intellectual property it's trying to sell. During due diligence, the buyers will ask the inventor to confirm the chain of ownership, and they will ask. At that point, you'll either have to ratify the assignment or tell the truth. If you tell the truth, this transaction can't legally close the way it's currently structured." She paused before adding quietly, "As for the forgery itself, that's a criminal matter under Ohio law. Whether anyone pursues it isn't your decision to make. It simply exists." I thanked her, ended the call, and sat in silence. That's when I finally understood something that changed everything. The real power in this story had never been my husband's wealth or my family's influence. The real power was a single signature I had never given and never would. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need money. I didn't need anyone to rescue me. All I had to do was refuse to lie. The quietest act imaginable. And the most expensive one of all. By then, my family could already sense that something had changed. Families like mine have an instinct for the exact moment the quiet one stops being quiet. My mother suddenly began hovering around me, refilling my coffee before my cup was empty, asking whether I was sleeping well, whether my marriage was happy, whether I was all right. Every question felt like a cautious hand testing whether a locked door might still open. That afternoon she joined me on the front porch, took my hand in hers, and quietly delivered the message I knew my father had sent her to deliver. "Whatever you and your father are tangled up about," she said softly, "please, sweetheart, let's keep it in the family. We don't air these things. We don't let strangers into our business. That's how we've always survived. Keep it in the family." It was simply the grown-up version of "she's just joking." The same spell with higher stakes. The same words used to make sure the truth never crossed the front door. Chloe had changed too. She stopped mocking me almost overnight. That evening she brought me a cup of tea I hadn't asked for, perched herself on the arm of my chair, and smiled with unusual tenderness. "You know I love you, right?" she asked. "No matter how this turns out." She had never once said those words to me sober. That's when I understood exactly what was happening. They had sensed the danger, and the entire house was quietly rearranging itself around me, softening me, managing me, pulling me gently back into the role I'd always played before I could do something irreversible. My mother squeezed my hand and whispered, "You've always been our strong one." Sitting there on that cold porch, I could almost feel the walls of the old house leaning inward. Warm, familiar, loving, and utterly determined to keep me exactly where I'd always been. Silent, dependable, carrying the weight that belonged to everyone else. The next morning, my father called what he described as a family meeting before the closing. "All of us together," he said, "to decide what's best for everyone." We gathered around the same long dining table where, just 3 nights earlier, I had been nothing more than the evening's punchline. Now, without anyone acknowledging it, I found myself seated at the head of the table. My father opened the meeting the way he addressed investors. Hands folded neatly, voice calm, measured, and authoritative. "We're at a crossroads as a family," he began. "There's been a paperwork issue, and we need to resolve it together. Quietly, lovingly, the way Bennetts always have." Then he slid a single sheet of paper across the polished wood toward me with a pen resting neatly on top. It was a brand new assignment agreement. Fresh, clean, dated that very week. Waiting for the signature he had failed to steal the first time. One signature would erase the forgery by making it true after the fact. One signature would allow the deal to close as though nothing dishonest had ever happened. "All you have to do," my father said gently, "is sign what you would have signed anyway. Then it's over. No scandal. No lawyers. No strangers. Just family. Taking care of family." My mother was quietly crying. Chloe watched me with an intensity that had nothing to do with affection. Every person at that table leaned ever so slightly toward me, waiting. I could feel the entire house pressing against my shoulders, urging me to do what I had always done, to make things smooth, to make things easy, to disappear so everyone else could remain comfortable. Sign the paper. Be the strong one. Keep the peace. Vanish one more time. I looked down at the pen. I looked at the empty signature line where my name was supposed to appear willingly this time. And suddenly I understood the machine my family had spent my entire life building. The goal had never been to forge my signature once. The goal was to convince me to forge it myself, to volunteer for my own erasure and call it love. I didn't sign that morning. I simply said I needed time to think. Then I folded the document, slipped it into my bag and walked away with it, a move no one at that table had expected. The meeting ended in uneasy silence. But something else broke open later that same day, and it came from the last person I expected. Chloe, my younger sister, who built careers around controlling narratives, had spent the days after Christmas doing exactly what I should have known she would do. She investigated Adrian. His name wasn't common, and his investment firm wasn't difficult to identify if you knew where to look. By that afternoon she knew exactly who my husband was, a partner at a fund with genuine influence in the very financial circles where our family's sale was trying to close. She found me alone in the guest room, and the expression on her face was unlike anything I'd ever seen directed at me. The mockery was gone. In its place was calculation. And beneath that, hope. "Mia," she said breathlessly as she sat down without waiting for an invitation. "Your husband, Adrian. Do you know who he is?" "Course you do. He's your husband." She gave a nervous, almost disbelieving laugh before looking me straight in the eyes. "Why didn't you tell us?" This changed everything. I watched, almost fascinated, as the story my family had told about me for 35 years, the pitiable single lesser daughter, the family joke, dissolved in real time and rebuilt itself into something entirely different. I was no longer the punchline. I was the connection. I was the escape hatch. For the first time in my life, I was suddenly worth treating kindly. And with a sinking certainty, I knew exactly what they were about to ask of me. Not forgiveness. Not even my signature anymore. Something bigger, dirtier, and carefully disguised as family loyalty. By that evening, everyone knew who Adrian really was, and the entire household rearranged itself around that discovery with breathtaking speed. My father poured me the expensive bourbon he had never once offered me before. My mother kept smoothing my hair as though affection could erase 15 years. Then came the request, passed from one person to the next so no single person had to own its ugliness. Couldn't I just have a word with Adrian? Couldn't he introduce the buyers to the right people, smooth things over, maybe even invest enough money that my inconvenient signature would no longer matter? Chloe smiled brightly as she suggested the simplest solution of all. Couldn't Adrian just make the whole due diligence problem disappear? Men like him know how to make these things go away. My father spread his hands like a preacher delivering a blessing. "You have this incredible resource, Mia. And you'd let your own family sink instead of making one phone call." He shook his head with practiced disappointment. "The Bennett name comes first. It always has. And right now, the name needs you." It was the third time I had heard those words that week, but it was the first time I truly understood them. The name comes first had never meant the family protected its own. It meant the family used whoever it needed to. For 15 years, the family name had used me by making me the joke. Now it wanted to use me by turning me into the savior. The machine hadn't changed. Only the price attached to my usefulness had. I looked around the room at people I still loved but could no longer trust, all of them reaching for a rescue built on burying a crime, and for the first time I saw the tradition clearly enough to break it. I did call Adrian that night, but not to ask him to save anyone. I stepped into the snowy backyard beneath the red and green Christmas lights my father had carefully strung across the fence and told my husband everything. The forged signature, the Rotterdam conference, the hidden panel, the family meeting, and the pressure to lie. He listened without interrupting, The way people listen when they truly want to understand instead of preparing their reply. It was one of the 10,000 reasons I had married him. When I finished, he didn't offer to fix it. He knew me better than that. "What do you want to do?" he asked. Not, "What should we do?" Just, "What do you want?" I told him I wanted to tell the truth and let the truth do whatever the truth was going to do. After a thoughtful pause, he said quietly, "You should know something. If our fund has any involvement with the buyer, and given the industry, it's possible, the moment your name becomes part of this matter, I have to recuse myself and declare a conflict of interest. I won't be allowed to touch it, and honestly, I wouldn't want to." I smiled into the cold night. "Good," I said. "That's exactly how it should be." Because that was the difference between the two families I had belonged to. My family's instinct was to use every relationship as leverage. My husband's instinct was to step away the moment his presence could influence the outcome. One believed power meant making problems disappear. The other believed integrity meant refusing to hide them. I stood outside for a long time after we hung up, watching my breath drift into the winter air, watching the cheerful Christmas lights blink across my father's carefully maintained, beautifully dishonest display, and I knew exactly what I would do at the closing. I only had to survive one more night. I stayed awake at the small desk in the guest room until nearly dawn and did the least dramatic yet most important thing I had ever done. I wrote a letter, not to my family, but to the buyer's legal counsel and the accountants handling the due diligence. It was short, factual, and completely free of anger. "I am the inventor of the chambered baffle design. I did not sign the assignment dated April 5 years ago. On that date I was in Rotterdam and I can prove it. I do not ratify that assignment. I remain the lawful owner of the design." I printed the letter and signed it with my real signature, the one with a slight downhill drift, the one that had always been unmistakably mine. Then I sealed it inside an envelope and placed it beside my keys. I sat there for a long time, forcing myself to look honestly at what that envelope meant, because I owed myself the truth. Delivering it wouldn't simply embarrass my father. It would stop the deal cold. There would be no clean closing, no investor money, and perhaps no company left in the form they had built. Dale could lose his job. My mother's retirement could shrink. 50 years of the Bennett name on that building might disappear. Every consequence could be traced back to one woman refusing to lie. I never pretended otherwise. I didn't comfort myself with fantasies that everything would somehow work out. It wouldn't. This was the line, and once I crossed it, there would never again be a version of the story where I was the good daughter. I rested my hand on the envelope in the darkness and never took it away. Before dawn, my mother came quietly into the guest room. Maybe she heard me moving, or maybe she simply sensed what every mother eventually does. She sat on the edge of the bed in her robe, small against the gray morning light, took my hand and made one final appeal. She reached for the deepest part of me without even realizing it. "You've always been our strong one," she whispered. "Ever since you were little. You could carry anything. You never needed as much as the rest of us. Chloe falls apart. Your father is all pride. But you've always been the one who could hold this family together without complaining." Tears filled her eyes. "Please don't become the one who breaks it. Just sign the paper. Make the call. Be who you've always been for us. Just this one last time." In that moment, I realized she wasn't trying to manipulate me. She was telling me the truest thing she had ever believed, that my worth in this family had always been measured by how much of myself I was willing to surrender for everyone else. They loved me, in the only way they knew how, because I disappeared beneath their burdens without asking for anything in return. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to me all week, and it broke my heart because I still couldn't give her what she wanted. I squeezed her hand and answered as gently as I could, so she would hear compassion instead of rejection. "Mom, I forgive him. I forgive all of you. But forgiveness isn't a signature." She stared at me, unable to understand. And I suddenly realized I had finally learned a language my mother had spent her entire life making sure no one in our family could speak. After she left, I remained in the quiet dawn, staring at the envelope beside my keys, and finally faced the truth I had spent 15 years avoiding. I had always told myself my silence was generosity. I believed letting them keep the panel, the credit, and the story was an act of love. I believed staying away and saying nothing protected everyone. But sitting there in that pale morning light, I saw the truth with perfect clarity. My silence had never protected anyone. It had financed them. Every year I accepted being the joke without answering back. I taught Chloe that humiliating me came without consequence. Every time I allowed my father to tell buyers the design was his, I taught him that taking from me cost him nothing. Every time my mother smiled and said, "She's just joking," and I smiled back, I helped build the very machine that eventually forged my name and expected me to thank it for the privilege. I had never been holding my family together. I had been holding their lie together. Being the strong one, the daughter who could carry anything, who supposedly needed less than everyone else, was never a compliment. It was a job description for the person trained to absorb everything the family refused to feel. The cruelest theft wasn't the forged signature. It was convincing me that erasing myself was a virtue. As the sky slowly shifted from gray to a pale winter gold above the rooftops, something inside me finally unclenched after 35 years. I didn't want revenge. I want you to understand that because it's the most important truth in this story. I never wanted to burn them down. I only wanted to stop being the fuel that kept the fire alive. The only way to stop being the fuel is to refuse out loud, to burn quietly instead. The closing was scheduled for 10 o'clock in the glass conference room at the firm. I walked in wearing my own coat, carrying my own envelope, and took a seat at the table without waiting to be offered one. The buyer's team was already there. The woman with the leather portfolio, 2 attorneys, and an accountant with a laptop open in front of him. My father sat at the head of the table in his best suit, gracious and confident, the founder about to be rewarded for 50 years of work. My mother sat silently against the wall with her hands folded in her lap. Chloe stood near the door, phone in hand, ready to spin whatever happened into whatever version of the story the family needed. The papers were stacked neatly, tabbed, polished, beautiful. My father was halfway through one of his favorite stories about the early workshop, the vision, the sacrifice, and the buyers smiled politely as if they were listening to history itself. Everything was moving exactly as planned, so clean it almost looked inevitable. For one brief moment I could see how this morning would have unfolded if I had never come home. Then the accountant looked up from his laptop and asked the question I'd been waiting all week to hear. Before we finalize the intellectual property transfer, just as a matter of routine, we need the inventor of the core design to confirm the assignment for the chain of title. Is the inventor available? Every head in the room turned toward me. My father's smile never disappeared, but his eyes found mine with both a warning and a plea, and beneath them, the absolute certainty that I would do what I had always done. Give in. Keep the peace. The room grew so quiet I could hear the heating system humming behind the walls. I placed my envelope gently on the glass table and understood that the next sentence out of my mouth would determine who I truly was. My father moved first, smooth as ever. That's my daughter, Mia, the inventor. He slid the fresh assignment across the table toward me. The new one, the clean one, the retroactive one, the pen already resting neatly on top. She's just confirming what she signed years ago. Go ahead, sweetheart. His voice was warm, confident, reassuring. My mother's hands tightened in her lap. Chloe held her breath by the door. All I had to do was pick up the pen. One signature, and the family would be saved. The deal would close. I'd walk out the hero who rescued everyone, finally, permanently worthy of their approval. I looked at the pen. I looked at my father. Then I pushed the pen back across the glass toward him. I'm not confirming it, I said quietly. Because I never signed it. The words hit the silence like a dropped tray. The buyer's attorney leaned forward. The accountant's fingers froze above his keyboard. The assignment in your binder is dated April, 5 years ago. I continued in the same calm, professional voice I use when explaining why a room echoes too long. On that date, I was in Rotterdam presenting at an international acoustics conference. I have the conference program, photographs, my passport stamps, and my hotel records. I did not sign that document. Someone signed it for me. I opened my envelope and slid my signed statement across the table toward the buyer's counsel. I am the inventor of this design. I never assigned my rights, and I will not ratify that forged document today simply to make this transaction easier. For the first time in 35 years, my father's face showed something I had never seen before. And into that stunned silence, as calm as the quietest room I had ever designed, I spoke the sentence I had been walking toward my entire life. I forgive you, Dad. But I'm still not signing. The lawyers were speechless, but my family recovered almost immediately. They always had another plan. Chloe crossed the room in 3 quick steps and whispered urgently, "Mia, call Adrian. Right now. He can make this disappear. 1 phone call. Please." My mother had risen from her chair, pale, saying my name like it was both a prayer and a question. My father turned toward the buyers with a practiced, effortless smile and gave a light, apologetic laugh. "Just a family misunderstanding," he said. "My daughter is very well connected. Her husband's investment fund has relationships in this space. I'm sure we can restructure this, bring in the right partners, and move forward." And in that moment, I realized none of them had actually heard me. They were still reaching for the same tool they had always relied on. Use the relationship, use the husband, use whatever influence was closest to make the truth disappear. It would have been so easy. All I had to do was pick up my phone. I could have let Adrian's name enter that room and watched everything bend around it. The deal would have been saved. My family would have been grateful. The forgery would have disappeared beneath layers of money and influence. And for the first time in my life, I would have been the most powerful person in the room. I would have been the daughter they finally admired instead of the daughter they quietly overlooked. That was the temptation. That had always been the temptation. To trade the truth for acceptance. But I looked around the conference room at my father, the buyers, the lawyers, my mother, and Chloe, and I quietly said, "No. Not by making a phone call, but by refusing to make one. I'm not asking my husband to fix this," I said, my voice calm enough that every person in the room heard every word. "He's already recused himself because there may be a conflict of interest, and neither he nor I will use his position to bury the truth. If Bennett Acoustics wants to use my design, you'll negotiate with me honestly, in writing and on the record. And before any agreement happens, this company will have to explain how my name ended up on a document I never signed." In that moment, victory and loss arrived together. Impossible to separate. I had reclaimed my name. I had reclaimed my voice. I had reclaimed the truth and the marriage I never wanted to hide again. But across the glass table, I watched my mother make her choice without speaking a single word. Faced with the truth, she chose the family name over her daughter. I let that realization settle because it was the price of telling the truth, and I had already decided I was willing to pay it. My father was the one who finally broke. His composure, the image he'd spent 50 years building, shattered in front of everyone. He shot to his feet, his face burning red, his voice cracking with rage. "After everything this family gave you," he shouted, no longer the polished founder addressing investors, but simply an angry old man whose story was collapsing around him. "You're willing to destroy everything over a piece of paper, over your pride. You always thought you were better than us. Better than the Bennett name." His palm slammed against the glass table hard enough to make the buyers flinch. "The name comes first." This time I let the words hang in the room. I let everyone hear them. Then I answered quietly, the way you stop an echo, not by shouting over it but by absorbing it. "No, Dad. The truth comes first. The name was simply what you called it whenever you wanted us to stay silent." He opened his mouth, but no words came. There wasn't an answer to that because the truth had already spoken. Chloe stood frozen beside the door, her phone dark in her hand, staring at me as though she were looking at a stranger, or perhaps seeing the real me for the first time. And then there was my mother. The woman who had spent my entire life saying, "She's just joking," every time someone hurt me. The woman who had begged me one last time to disappear for the sake of the family. She slowly covered her mouth, turned away from me, and looked toward my father instead. In the only moment that truly mattered, she chose him. She chose the family name. She chose the comfortable lie over the daughter who was finally telling the truth. I had expected it. I'd spent the entire night preparing myself for it. It still broke my heart with a clean, unmistakable pain, the kind that only comes from losing something you already knew was gone. Around us, the buyers quietly gathered their documents. The closing was over before anyone officially announced it. I stood there in the ruins of the story my family had spent decades telling about itself, feeling lighter than I had in 15 years and lonelier than I had ever been, both emotions arriving together. But here's the part that matters most. Nobody was destroyed by power. My husband never made a phone call. No investment fund swooped in to punish my family. No dramatic revenge unfolded. The only thing that happened was that the truth was finally placed on the record, and once it was there, it simply did what truth always does. The buyer's attorneys, bound by their professional duty, could not complete a transaction built on a broken chain of title. The accountant flagged the forged assignment immediately. Counsel advised that the company first had to correct its records, which meant acknowledging in writing that a signature had been forged, and determining who had forged it. My statement remained in the file, calm, factual, and impossible to argue with. From that point on, the law did exactly what it was designed to do. Slowly, methodically, and with complete indifference to the Bennett name. There would almost certainly be civil consequences for the forgery, but that part was never mine to pursue or to forgive. As my attorney had already explained, that process simply existed, whether I wanted revenge or not. The chambered baffle design legally returned to the person who had always owned it, me. And the machine my father had spent decades building, the one powered by my silence and my willingness to disappear, finally sputtered to a stop the moment I refused to feed it anymore. I didn't win because I had money. I didn't win because of my husband. I didn't win because I threatened anyone. I won because, in a quiet room with a steady voice, I declined to sign my name to a lie. It was the smallest act I had ever committed, and it brought down the biggest illusion my family had ever built. Not because I was powerful, but because that illusion had been standing on the one word I finally refused to give them. I'd like to tell you the family fell apart and everyone got exactly what they deserved. But that's the version people post on Reddit. This is the real one. Bennett Acoustics didn't disappear, it shrank. The big acquisition collapsed, but months later, after the records were corrected and the chain of title was finally clean, a smaller, honest deal came through. The company survived at a size that reflected what it had truly earned instead of what it had falsely claimed to own. Dale kept his job. My father never admitted he was wrong. To this day, he tells people I betrayed the family out of pride, and in his own mind, he is still the wounded founder abandoned by an ungrateful daughter. That's the tragedy of a man who was robbed when he was young and decided robbery was simply how families survived. He cannot afford to see it any other way. My mother and I speak occasionally now, carefully, across a distance that no longer pretends to be closeness. She has never apologized, and I've stopped waiting for one. Chloe surprised me the most. She never truly apologized either, but something in her changed. She grew quiet, not her usual calculating silence, but the kind that listens. Months later, she called me just to ask how design licensing actually worked, and for the first time in 35 years, she asked me a genuine question about my work and waited patiently for the real answer. When I returned to Chicago, the first thing I did was stop hiding Adrian. There was no dramatic announcement, just an end to the secrecy. I realized I'd hidden my marriage for the same reason I'd hidden my name behind that panel. Anything I loved and allowed my family to see eventually became either the punchline to a joke or a resource to be used. But I don't live in that house anymore, and I no longer have to protect my happiness by making it invisible. The second thing I did took longer. Chloe has an 8-year-old daughter, my niece, bright, fearless, and already being labeled the dramatic one, the difficult one, too much, exactly the way these stories always begin. The last time I saw her, she asked what I did for a living. Instead of shrinking my answer into something polite, I told her the truth. I make rooms where people can finally hear themselves think. Then I showed her how an acoustic panel works. How silence isn't something you simply endure, but something you can shape. I watched her eyes widen as she realized a woman could build something, sign her own name to it, and never apologize for taking up space. That's how cycles are broken. Not by winning a war, but by making sure the next quiet girl in the family learns early that she never has to disappear to be loved. Panel 001 hangs in my Chicago studio now. After the deal collapsed and the company's assets were reorganized, I bought back the original panel for almost nothing. No one else wanted an old prototype, and my father couldn't bear to look at it anymore. I mounted it on my wall, but I turned it around. The front faces the wall. The back faces the room, so the first thing anyone sees is the pale wooden frame and the block letters a 24-year-old woman carved into it when she thought no one else ever would. MB. Beneath it is the sentence that carried me through everything. The room where you can finally hear yourself think. Clients ask about it sometimes. Depending on the day, I tell them either the short version or the whole story. And after everything that's happened, this is the only wisdom I know for certain. Forgiveness does not mean signing your name to the thing that erased you. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for a family is refuse to disappear inside it. That's my story. Forged signature. Quiet toast. A name that was stolen once, and refused a second time. If you've ever been the strong one, the quiet one, the one who kept the peace until it started costing you your own identity, ask yourself tonight whether you're protecting peace or funding a lie. Then choose the brave, quiet thing. If this story spoke to your heart, leave a comment and tell me what burden you finally stopped carrying. Subscribe for more stories like this, and until next time, protect your peace, protect your name, and never let anyone convince you that disappearing is the same thing as love.